The wind howled like a wild beast across the frozen wasteland. Snow swirled violently, blinding anything in its path. The ice stretched endlessly, with no sign of life or shelter. John pulled his fur-lined hood tighter, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. His body ached from the cold, and each step felt heavier than the last. John was alone. His shuttle had crashed miles away, and the communication device was nothing but a pile of broken circuits. He had been walking for hours, hoping to find some kind of shelter before the deadly cold consumed him. His thermal suit was failing. The power meter blinked red, signaling he had less than an hour of heat left. As he stumbled forward, John's eyes scanned the horizon. He could barely see through the thick snow, but in the distance, a faint light flickered. He blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But there it was, a soft, bluish glow cutting through the storm. "Shelter," he muttered under his breath, pushing himself to move faster. The light grew brighter as he approached. To his surprise, he found an igloo-shaped structure, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls shimmered like crystal, reflecting the faint light of a small fire burning inside. The entrance was partially open, a thin curtain of ice acting as a door. John hesitated. Who had built this? Was it a trap or some kind of natural formation? But the biting cold left him no choice. He stepped closer and gently tapped on the icy wall. Suddenly, the curtain shifted. A pair of glowing violet eyes peered out at him from the darkness. John's heart raced. The figure behind the entrance was small, barely reaching his chest, and wrapped tightly in heavy furs. It wasn't human. That much was clear. The pale skin, almost crystalline, shimmered under the faint light. The figure opened the curtain wider, allowing John to see her more clearly. She was alien but strangely delicate, with long white hair that fell over her shoulders in loose waves. Her eyes, though cautious, seemed to plead for something, perhaps warmth or safety. John raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "I need shelter," he said, his voice low and careful. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, as if understanding his situation, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Inside the igloo, it was warmer than he expected. A small fire burned in a carved-out stone pit, and the walls seemed to trap the heat, creating a cocoon against the cold. John knelt near the fire, stretching his frozen hands toward the flames. His suit's heating system buzzed faintly, trying to recover. The alien woman sat across from him, wrapping herself tighter in her fur cloak. She watched him carefully, her violet eyes never leaving his face. John felt the tension in the room. Two strangers, forced together by the unforgiving storm. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking the silence. The woman tilted her head slightly but didn't respond. John guessed she didn't speak his language. Still, there was a sense of mutual understanding. Survival didn't need words. After a few moments, she pointed at John's gloves and then at herself. Her hands, though mostly hidden beneath the cloak, were trembling. She was cold, despite the fire. John hesitated but slowly pulled off one of his gloves, offering it to her. She accepted it carefully, her fingers brushing against his for just a second. Her touch was freezing, colder than he expected. She held the glove close to her chest, as if trying to absorb any warmth it held. "What happened to you?" John asked, even though he knew she wouldn't answer. She only lowered her gaze, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. Time passed slowly. The storm outside showed no sign of stopping, and the howling wind felt like it was shaking the very walls of the igloo. John glanced toward the entrance, half expecting to see shadows moving in the snow. But the night remained quiet, apart from the storm. The alien woman finally spoke, her voice soft and melodic, though the words meant nothing to John. She pointed to herself and said, "Elira." "Elira," John repeated, nodding. "I'm John." Though she didn't fully understand, she smiled faintly at the introduction. John shifted closer to the fire, feeling the exhaustion creeping in. His body begged for rest, but he forced his eyes to stay open. Something about Elira's demeanor told him she wasn't just hiding from the cold. She was hiding from something else. As John stared into the flickering fire, he wondered what dangers lurked out in the snow. The storm might pass by morning, but he knew this was just the beginning. Whatever had driven Elira to seek shelter in this lonely, frozen wasteland was still out there. And it might be watching them, even now. John glanced at Elira one last time. She sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the entrance, listening carefully to the sounds outside. And in that moment, John realized the storm wasn't the only thing they had to survive. The storm outside roared like a restless beast, but inside the crystal igloo, there was an uneasy stillness. The faint crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence. John sat near the flames, his hands outstretched, trying to soak in every ounce of warmth the small fire could offer. Across from him, Elira sat wrapped in heavy furs, watching him with quiet intensity. Her violet eyes reflected the firelight, giving her an almost ethereal glow. John found it hard to look away. There was something captivating about her, though he couldn't explain why. Despite the warmth of the fire, Elira's body trembled slightly. Her hands, hidden beneath the thick layers, occasionally slipped free, revealing pale, almost translucent skin. She rubbed them together, but the effort seemed futile. John noticed her shivering. Without a second thought, he unzipped a small compartment on his survival suit, pulling out a thin, heat-reflective blanket. Wordlessly, he held it out to her. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to accept, but the cold left little room for pride. Elira reached forward, her slender fingers brushing against his as she took the blanket. Her touch was colder than ice, and John winced slightly. "You're freezing," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Elira wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders and nodded in gratitude. She didn't speak, but the faint smile that flickered across her lips said enough. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. John glanced around the igloo, taking in the strange yet beautiful craftsmanship. The walls were smooth and flawless, as if sculpted by expert hands. The crystal-like ice refracted the light from the fire, making the entire space shimmer softly. "This isn't normal ice," John said aloud, running his gloved hand along the wall. The surface was cold, yet somehow not as frigid as the outside world. Elira watched him carefully, then leaned forward, tracing a symbol into the ice with her finger. It was a shape John didn't recognize, a swirling pattern that resembled a spiral. "What does that mean?" he asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she drew another symbol next to it, this one resembling jagged lines, like sharp teeth. John frowned. Was she trying to warn him? Before he could ask, Elira suddenly pointed to the entrance of the igloo. Her eyes narrowed, and her body tensed. John turned, expecting to see something outside, but the snow-covered curtain remained still. The wind, however, had shifted, carrying a strange, distant sound. It was faint, almost like footsteps crunching through snow, too soft to be natural. He felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. "What is that?" he whispered. Elira didn't respond immediately. She stood slowly, her movements graceful but cautious. Carefully, she approached the entrance and pulled back the curtain just slightly, peering out into the storm. John rose to his feet, gripping the survival knife strapped to his leg. He wasn't sure what good a blade would do against whatever lurked outside, but it was better than nothing. After a long pause, Elira stepped back, letting the curtain fall into place. She exhaled softly and shook her head, indicating the danger had passed, for now. John relaxed, but the unease lingered. As Elira returned to her spot near the fire, John lowered himself beside her, placing the knife within easy reach. "Are you out here alone?" he asked, though he wasn't expecting an answer. To his surprise, Elira nodded slowly. John's eyes narrowed. "Why?" She hesitated, then drew another symbol in the ice, a simple, lone figure standing beneath a crescent moon. "You're hiding," John guessed. Elira met his gaze, and for the first time, her expression hardened. There was fear in her eyes, but also something else, resolve. John didn't press further. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't his business. At least, not yet. Instead, he leaned back, resting against the igloo wall. "Guess we're both stuck out here," he muttered, closing his eyes briefly. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across the crystalline walls. Elira sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Though her posture was calm, John could tell she was listening, waiting for something. The storm outside raged on, but deep within the ice igloo, two strangers shared an unspoken understanding. They were survivors, clinging to the fragile warmth of the fire, but John couldn't shake the feeling that this temporary peace wouldn't last. Something was out there. And whatever it was, Elira wasn't just hiding from it, she was preparing for it. John tightened his grip on the knife, letting the weight of it ground him. He had survived worse. Whatever was coming, he'd face it the same way he always had, one step at a time. The fire had burned low, leaving the igloo bathed in flickering shadows. John sat cross-legged, listening to the faint crackle of melting ice as droplets trickled from the crystal walls. The storm outside hadn't let up. If anything, the wind had grown louder, almost rhythmic, as if something was moving through the snow. Across from him, Elira remained still, her gaze fixed on the entrance. She hadn't spoken for a long time, but John could tell she was listening carefully. The soft glow in her violet eyes reflected the dim light, making her features appear even more delicate in the darkness. John didn't know much about Elira, but one thing was clear. She wasn't just afraid of the cold. She was waiting for something, or someone. "Are you sure there's nothing out there?" John asked, keeping his voice low. Elira's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment, and she shook her head. She wasn't sure. John exhaled slowly, leaning back against the icy wall. His survival knife lay beside him, the only real weapon he had. It felt woefully inadequate against the unknown. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the curtain of snow covering the entrance. Every few minutes, he thought he saw something moving beyond it, shadows that danced just at the edge of his vision. "Elira," John whispered, "what exactly are we hiding from?" For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, without speaking, she leaned forward and began tracing symbols into the ice floor with her finger. The lines glowed faintly, as if the ice itself remembered the touch of her hand. First, she drew a large circle, perhaps the planet they were on. Then jagged lines appeared above it, resembling mountains or ice peaks. John nodded, following along. "Okay, the planet." And next, Elira drew small stick figures beneath the peaks, clustered together like a village. But above them, she carefully carved several larger shapes, each one sharp and predatory, with glowing eyes etched into the ice. John's frown deepened. "Those are the hunters, aren't they?" Elira nodded solemnly. The hunters. John didn't know what they looked like, but from the way she drew them, they were clearly dangerous, taller than humans, and menacing in form. Elira added another figure, standing apart from the others. This one was alone, facing away from the village. She pointed to it, then to herself. "You left your people," John guessed aloud, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" Elira hesitated, as if she wasn't sure how to explain. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed at the entrance, her face tense. John's heart skipped. He glanced toward the curtain again, but the snow remained undisturbed. "Elira," he began, but before he could finish, the faint sound of crunching snow echoed from outside. It wasn't the wind this time. John froze, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Elira shifted slightly, reaching beneath the furs that covered her. When she pulled her hand free, John's eyes widened. She was holding a thin, crystalline spear, nearly invisible in the dim light, but razor-sharp. "Hold on," John whispered, gripping his knife. "Are we seriously going to fight whatever's out there?" Elira didn't answer. She just kept her gaze locked on the entrance, muscles tense like a coiled spring. The footsteps stopped just beyond the igloo. John held his breath, every muscle in his body screaming to move, but he stayed perfectly still. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scratches ran down the outer walls of the igloo, slow and methodical. Whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. It was searching, testing. John's grip tightened around the knife. The sound reminded him of wolves circling prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. But this felt worse. There was an intelligence behind those scratches, a patience that no animal should have. Elira met his gaze, her eyes sharp. She didn't speak, but John understood the message clearly. Don't move. Don't make a sound. The scratching circled the igloo, pausing every few feet. John counted each step in his head, wondering how large the creature must be. From the heaviness of its footsteps, it was massive, far larger than either of them. Suddenly, the sound stopped at the entrance. John felt his heart thudding in his chest. He glanced at Elira, who had positioned herself low to the ground, spear at the ready. Seconds passed. Then, slowly, the curtain shifted. A shadow loomed against the entrance, blocking the faint light of the fire. John could barely make out the outline. Tall, with broad shoulders and elongated limbs. Its head tilted slightly, almost as if it was listening for them. John clenched his knife, ready to strike if it stepped inside. But just as quickly as it appeared, the figure retreated, fading back into the storm. The footsteps grew distant until they disappeared entirely. John let out a shaky breath, lowering his knife. His heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. Elira remained tense for several moments longer, still listening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she relaxed, lowering her spear. John wiped the sweat from his brow, despite the cold air. "That was too close," he muttered. Elira nodded in agreement. John leaned back, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over him. Whatever that thing was, it's going to come back, isn't it? Elira didn't need to answer. The look in her eyes said enough. They had survived the night, but the hunters weren't gone. Not yet. The fire crackled softly, but its warmth did little to dispel the heavy silence that had settled over the igloo. Outside, the wind moaned, twisting and curling around the crystal walls like a restless ghost. John sat cross-legged near the flames, watching the flicker of orange and gold reflect across the smooth ice. Across from him, Elira sat with her spear resting across her lap. Though the danger seemed to have passed for now, her eyes never strayed far from the entrance. John sighed and leaned back, resting his head against the cool wall. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind raced with questions. "What was that thing?" he asked, breaking the silence. Elira's gaze shifted toward him. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached down and began drawing in the ice again. John leaned closer, watching as her fingers traced the shapes carefully. She drew the jagged outlines of the hunters once more, their sharp eyes glowing in the fire's reflection. "They've been following you, haven't they?" John guessed, watching her work. Elira nodded but continued drawing. This time, she added another set of figures, small and clustered together, like the image of her village she had carved before. But this time, something was different. Above the village, she sketched something else, a large, looming figure standing on a ridge, watching from afar. John's brows furrowed. "That's you." Elira nodded again. Her hand hovered over the symbol for a long moment before she erased it with the palm of her hand. "You left," John said softly, piecing it together. "You left your people behind." Elira's violet eyes dimmed, the faint glow fading as she lowered her gaze. There was no anger or frustration in her face, just sadness. John rubbed his hands together, letting the heat sink into his skin. "I know what it's like," he muttered, "being alone." Elira glanced up at him, tilting her head slightly. I used to run supply routes between outposts, John explained, staring into the fire. Mostly ice planets like this. It paid well, but no one ever tells you how quiet space gets when you're out there by yourself. He chuckled dryly. I thought I could handle it. Guess I was wrong. Crashed my shuttle after a storm caught me off guard. John's gaze shifted toward Illyra. Now I'm stuck here. Same as you. Illyra listened intently, her head tilting further as if trying to piece together his words. Though the language barrier still lingered between them, John felt like she understood. Perhaps not the words, but the meaning behind them. She reached out and gently pressed her palm against the ice wall, leaving a faint handprint behind. The light beneath her skin glowed softly, illuminating the mark. John raised an eyebrow. What's that? Illyra smiled faintly and pointed to the fire, then to the wall. The handprint shimmered in response. Heat, John guessed. It reacts to warmth. Illyra nodded. Curious, John pressed his hand against the wall as well. His glove left nothing but a smudge of fog. Illyra laughed softly, the sound like wind chimes, and gently pressed his bare hand against the ice. As soon as his skin made contact, the wall glowed faintly beneath his palm, though not as brightly as Illyra's touch. John pulled his hand back and frowned. I don't get it. Why does it react to you? Illyra placed her hand beside his, showing the difference in the brightness between them. Then she tapped her chest lightly and pointed back to the glowing handprint. You're different, John muttered, realization dawning. Your body generates heat differently. Illyra nodded, but before John could ask more, she began drawing again. This time, she etched an intricate symbol, more complex than anything she had drawn before. The shape spiraled outward, with smaller circles and patterns connected by thin lines. John watched closely, mesmerized by the detail. What's that? Illyra pointed to the fire again, then to the symbol. She pressed her palm against the center of the drawing, and the entire pattern lit up, spreading outwards in pulses of light. John's eyes widened. Is that a map? Illyra nodded firmly. John leaned closer, examining the shape carefully. It didn't look like any planet he recognized, but the way the patterns curved suggested pathways or tunnels beneath the surface. You know how to navigate this place, John realized aloud. That's how you've survived out here. Illyra smiled faintly but said nothing. John ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. You're full of surprises, you know that. Illyra tilted her head, curiosity dancing in her eyes. Before John could say more, the wind outside shifted. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Illyra's expression darkened. Her eyes narrowed, and she gripped her spear once more. John sat upright, listening closely. The wind had grown quieter, but the eerie calm felt more unsettling than the storm. Is it them? John whispered. Illyra didn't answer. She rose slowly to her feet, stepping toward the entrance. John followed, grabbing his knife. Together, they stood by the curtain of ice, waiting. For several moments, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, John heard it. A distant howl, echoing through the snow like the mournful cry of something ancient and hungry. John tightened his grip on the blade. Guess we're not getting much sleep tonight, he muttered. Illyra glanced at him, her spear held steady, and for the first time since they met, she smiled, not out of amusement, but out of understanding. In that quiet moment, John realized something. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by chance. They were survivors, and whatever was out there in the snow, it would have to face both of them. The wind had stopped. John noticed it immediately. The absence of the constant howling outside felt unnatural, as if the entire planet was holding its breath. The silence was heavier than the cold, pressing down on the igloo like an invisible weight. He tightened the straps on his gloves, his eyes flicking toward the entrance. Illyra stood a few feet away, her back to him, head tilted slightly as she listened. She had been like this for over an hour, motionless, alert, gripping the crystalline spear as if expecting the curtain of ice to shift at any second. John didn't disturb her. He knew better now. Something was out there. Finally, Elira lowered her weapon, but she didn't relax. She glanced at John, and though no words passed between them, the message was clear. It's not over. John exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together near the dying fire. I don't know how long this little dance can last, he muttered, but I'd prefer to face it on my terms. Elira's eyes flickered to the wall where she had drawn the glowing map of tunnels and pathways beneath the ice. She traced one of the spirals with her fingertip and then pointed to John. You want to move? He guessed. Elira nodded firmly. John hesitated. I'm all for getting out of here, but do you really think it's safer out there? She gave him a sharp look, not angry, but urgent. That was answer enough. John rose to his feet, strapping his knife securely to his belt. He had been in worse situations before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just survival. It was a chase, and he had a sinking feeling they were the prey. Elira moved to the far side of the igloo, crouching by the back wall. She placed her palm against the ice, and to John's surprise, the surface shimmered faintly. A faint crack began to spread outward in a circular pattern, until a large chunk of the wall silently folded inward, revealing a narrow tunnel. John blinked. How did you? Elira placed a finger to her lips, gesturing for silence. John nodded and stepped inside the tunnel, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Elira followed closely behind, sealing the entrance behind them with a gentle press of her hand. The tunnel glowed faintly, illuminated by the same strange energy that Elira seemed to command. John marveled at it as they moved deeper underground, the air around them growing noticeably warmer. Is this one of the pathways you drew on the map? He asked in a hushed voice. Elira nodded but kept walking without slowing her pace. John's eyes narrowed. You've done this before, haven't you? She paused for a brief second, glancing back at him. Her expression was unreadable, but the weight behind her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She had traveled this path many times, but never with anyone else. As they continued forward, the faint sound of the wind returned, echoing through the tunnel behind them. It was distant, but there was something off about it, something rhythmic, like the heavy steps of creatures moving in unison. John's heart sank. They're following us, he whispered. Elira didn't respond. She simply gripped her spear tighter and quickened her pace. The tunnel twisted and turned, and John found himself struggling to keep up. His breath came in shallow bursts, fogging the air ahead of him. Suddenly, Elira came to an abrupt stop. John nearly collided with her, catching himself against the tunnel wall. What is it? He asked, but when he followed her gaze, his stomach dropped. The tunnel ahead opened into a vast cavern, but the ground was jagged and unstable, with large shards of ice jutting upward like teeth. A thin bridge of crystal stretched across the cavern, leading to another pathway on the opposite side. Below, the dark abyss seemed to swallow the light. Of course, John muttered. Why wouldn't there be a death trap in the middle of this escape plan? Elira stepped forward carefully, testing the strength of the bridge with the butt of her spear. It held firm, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her unease. John frowned. You're not sure it can hold both of us, are you? She hesitated before shaking her head. John sighed. Great. Elira pointed at him and then gestured toward the bridge. You want me to go first? She nodded. Fine, John grumbled, stepping onto the bridge. The crystal groaned softly beneath his weight, but it held. He took slow, deliberate steps, trying not to look down at the yawning chasm below. Halfway across, the wind returned, stronger this time. John gripped the ice railing tightly, bracing himself as the bridge trembled. Elira, he shouted, but she was already moving, sprinting across the bridge with surprising speed. She reached his side just as the first faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them. John glanced over his shoulder. Dark shapes emerged at the far end of the tunnel, their glowing eyes locking onto him. "Move," Elira urged, her voice sharp and urgent. John didn't need to be told twice. He broke into a run, the bridge shuddering beneath them with each step. The hunters followed, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground. As they reached the far side, Elira spun around, slamming the butt of her spear into the bridge behind them. Cracks spread like wildfire, and within seconds the crystal collapsed, plunging into the abyss below. The hunters skidded to a halt at the edge, staring down into the dark void. John bent over, gasping for breath. That was way too close. Elira lowered her spear, exhaling softly. John glanced at her, shaking his head. "Next time, maybe warn me before we cross something that might kill us." She smiled faintly, the first hint of amusement he had seen since they met. But as they turned to continue deeper into the tunnels, John couldn't shake the feeling that the hunters wouldn't stop so easily. The chase was far from over. The tunnel twisted downward, spiraling deeper into the heart of the frozen world. The air grew warmer the further they went, but John couldn't shake the cold grip of dread in his chest. The collapse of the bridge had bought them time, but not much. Elira led the way, her spear held at the ready. She moved with practiced ease, as if the ice beneath her feet was an extension of her own body. John followed close behind, his knife gripped tightly in one hand. The deeper they descended, the quieter it became. The wind was gone now, replaced by an eerie silence that stretched endlessly. Even John's footsteps felt muffled against the smooth ice. "Where are we going?" John whispered, his voice barely louder than a breath. Elira glanced back at him and gestured ahead, pointing to the faint blue glow that emanated from the end of the tunnel. John squinted. As they approached, the passage widened, opening into a vast underground chamber. John's eyes widened in awe. The cavern stretched out before them, its walls lined with jagged ice formations that glowed softly, casting a gentle blue light across the room. In the center stood a massive structure, carved directly into the ice, a fortress of sorts, with high walls and sharp, towering spires. "What is this place?" John murmured, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. Elira didn't answer, but her expression softened slightly, as if they had reached something familiar. She motioned for John to follow and crossed the chamber toward the entrance of the ice fortress. The large arched doorway loomed ahead, flanked by two statues carved from the same crystalline ice. Their features were alien but elegant, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to follow them as they passed. John shivered. "Comforting," he muttered. Inside, the air was warmer still. The walls shimmered with the same faint glow, illuminating the corridor ahead. John stopped abruptly. "Hold on," he said, grabbing Elira's arm. "This place, is it safe?" She met his gaze, her expression calm but serious. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. John spun around, knife raised. His heart pounded as the shadows at the tunnel's entrance shifted. The hunters had found them. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, their glowing eyes piercing the blue light of the cavern. They were taller than John had expected, with long, sinewy limbs and broad shoulders covered in dark, fur-like armor that shimmered faintly. Each carried a weapon, jagged blades made of the same crystalline ice that surrounded them. John cursed under his breath. I was hoping they'd give up. Elira stepped in front of him, spear raised, her stance solid and unyielding. John took a step back. "Okay, I'll let you take the lead on this one." The hunters moved forward slowly, their gaze fixed on Elira. They didn't seem to acknowledge John. Not at first. One of the hunters snarled, the sound low and guttural, before lunging forward. Elira reacted instantly, her spear flashing in the dim light. She sidestepped gracefully, slashing the weapon across the hunter's arm. The creature howled in pain, its blood scattering across the ice in glowing blue droplets. John's eyes widened. Their blood glows. The second hunter charged, forcing John to snap out of his daze. He ducked low, barely avoiding a swipe aimed at his head. With a grunt, He drove his knife into the creature's side. The blade struck deep, but the hunter barely flinched. John's stomach twisted. Oh, great. They don't go down easy. Elira spun, thrusting her spear through the chest of the first hunter. It staggered, collapsing to the ground in a heap. She withdrew her weapon swiftly, turning to face the remaining two. John backed away, keeping his knife raised. I'm guessing we can't talk this out. The hunters circled them carefully now, their movements slower, more deliberate. They had seen Elira fight. They wouldn't underestimate her again. Elira, John said cautiously, not taking his eyes off the hunters, if you've got a plan, now's the time. She didn't respond, but John noticed her shifting closer to the fortress entrance. Wait, he said, realization dawning. You want to lure them inside. Elira nodded subtly. John swallowed hard. I hope you know what you're doing. The hunters lunged again, forcing them both to retreat further into the fortress. The moment they crossed the threshold, the walls around them pulsed faintly, as if responding to their presence. Elira spun and drove her spear into the ice, causing a loud crack to echo through the corridor. John stumbled back as the ground beneath the hunters trembled. Large shards of ice erupted from the floor, sealing the entrance behind them. The hunters barely had time to react before the icy spikes pierced through their bodies. The remaining two hunters slumped to the ground, their glowing blood seeping into the cracks. John stared at the scene in stunned silence, his chest heaving. You could have done that earlier, he panted, leaning against the wall. Elira smiled faintly and shook her head. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, I'll give you credit. That was impressive. Elira knelt beside one of the fallen hunters, inspecting its body carefully. She retrieved one of the jagged ice blades, holding it up to the light. John raised an eyebrow. Planning to keep that? She nodded. Well, I guess a souvenir isn't a bad idea, he muttered, rubbing his sore shoulder. I just hope there aren't more of them. Elira's gaze darkened, and John immediately regretted his words. There are more, aren't there? Elira didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. John groaned. Fantastic. So what now? She motioned further into the fortress, signaling for him to follow. John hesitated but eventually fell into step beside her. As they ventured deeper, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. But one thing was certain. They wouldn't face it alone. The silence that followed the battle felt almost fragile, like the calm before another storm. John followed Elira deeper into the ice fortress, his footsteps echoing faintly against the smooth, crystalline floor. The glow of the surrounding ice cast long shadows that danced along the walls, flickering with every step they took. Despite the victory, John's grip remained tight on his knife. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching them. Elira walked ahead, clutching the jagged ice blade she had taken from the fallen hunter. Her posture had eased slightly, but the careful way she moved told John she wasn't letting her guard down just yet. As they entered a large chamber, John paused, his eyes widening. The room was unlike anything he had seen before. Massive ice pillars stretched toward the ceiling, and in the center of the chamber stood an altar-like structure, surrounded by a ring of what looked like frozen statues. Each figure bore the same elongated features as Elira, their heads bowed as if in prayer or mourning. Elira approached the statues slowly, running her hand along one of their shoulders. The figure's eyes shimmered faintly beneath the ice, and for a brief second, John thought he saw the statue's gaze shift slightly. They're not just statues, are they? John asked cautiously. Elira stopped, lowering her hand, but she didn't respond. John stepped closer, squinting at the nearest figure. Its surface was rough with frost, but beneath the ice, he could make out the faint outline of veins. Not stone, but frozen flesh. His stomach twisted. They're your people. Elira's gaze dropped to the ground, and she nodded slowly. John exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. How long have they been like this? She pointed to the altar, then held up 3 fingers. 3 years? John guessed. Elira shook her head and added more fingers, stopping at 10. John's eyes widened. 10 years. They'd been frozen for 10 years. She nodded again, stepping toward the altar. John followed, his boots crunching softly over the ice. As he reached the center of the chamber, he noticed something embedded in the altar, a large crystal shard, glowing faintly beneath the surface. Elira knelt beside it, placing her palm on the crystal. The glow brightened slightly, and John could feel the heat radiating from it even from where he stood. He crouched beside her, watching curiously. Is that why they're frozen? Some kind of power source? Elira hesitated, then carved another symbol into the ice with the tip of her spear. It resembled a heart, not the shape humans drew, but something more intricate, with spiraling lines extending outward. John frowned. Life energy. She nodded, pressing her hand to the symbol. So this thing is keeping them in stasis, John muttered. But why? Elira didn't answer immediately. She stood, motioning for John to follow her toward another corridor that branched off from the chamber. As they walked, John couldn't help but glance back at the frozen figures. He had faced loneliness before, drifting alone through space, stranded on alien worlds. But what Elira carried was something far heavier. She hadn't just survived. She had been left behind. The corridor led to a smaller room, more intimate than the others. A fire pit sat in the center, though it had long since burned out, and several thick fur blankets lined the walls. Elira knelt beside the pit, pulling flint from a small pouch at her waist. With a few quick strikes, the fire roared to life, casting warmth and light across the room. John sank to the ground beside her, stretching his hands toward the flames. "This feels better," he muttered, letting out a sigh of relief. Elira sat beside him, her spear resting against her shoulder. The flickering fire reflected in her violet eyes, and for the first time since they met, her expression softened. For a while, neither of them spoke. The crackle of the fire was the only sound between them. Eventually, John broke the silence. "You know, we make a pretty good team." Elira glanced at him, the corners of her lips curving slightly in what John could only guess was amusement. "I mean it," John continued, leaning back against the wall. "I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Elira tilted her head, as if trying to understand the weight behind his words. John sighed. "I've been alone for a long time. After the crash, I thought that was it. End of the road. But somehow, I ended up here. With you." Elira met his gaze, something gentle flickering behind her eyes. John hesitated, then added, "Maybe. It's not the worst thing. Being stuck here, I mean." A long pause followed, but eventually, Elira placed her hand lightly on his arm, her touch warm despite the cold that surrounded them. John glanced down at her hand, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. For the first time in days, it felt peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. A distant howl echoed through the fortress, low and mournful, vibrating through the ice beneath them. John sat up immediately, his heart pounding. "They're still out there." Elira's expression darkened. She grabbed her spear and rose to her feet, motioning for John to follow. As they stepped back into the main chamber, John felt the temperature drop sharply. The blue glow of the ice had dimmed, and faint shadows flickered near the entrance they had sealed earlier. "Guess they weren't done with us yet," John muttered, gripping his knife. Elira raised her spear, her stance unshaken. John smirked faintly. "All right, let's finish this." They stood side by side, the firelight casting long shadows across the chamber floor. And for the first time, in a long while, John didn't feel alone.